This is the Episcopal rebuttal regarding the Presbyterian form of church government. As my colleague stated so well, one thing that we can all agree on is that we do need some form of church government. We need some form of organization so that the church does not fall into chaos. Where we disagree is what form of church government is the best. As my colleague noted, one of the things that the Presbyterian Protestant Church is known for is standing for sola scriptura, looking solely to the Scripture for their basis. My one concern, however, is that when we look at Scripture, there is no one biblical model that is established in Scripture for church government. What we see instead are suggestions for a form of church government, a foundation, the seeds of church government. And when we take those, we can develop the type of church government that works best. When we take the seeds that are in Scripture and combine them with the tradition and the history that was led by God, we see the best form of church government. So we cannot completely discount the importance of tradition and history. We can see the seeds of an Episcopal form of church government in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. When we look at the establishment of the priest in the temple and in the tabernacle with the high priest, the priest, and the Levites, we see that similar setup as the threefold ministry within the Episcopal Church of the bishop, the priest, and the deacons. These were established in Scripture and through history and tradition. We can't discount the fact that God directed the church and led the church into an Episcopal form of church government. For centuries after the establishment of the church with the apostles, for the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries on through, the only form of church government that we find is the Episcopal form of church government. So we cannot discount the importance of that, because to discount that is to discount God leading His church during that time. It is also important to note that part of what allows the Presbyterian Church, the Protestant Church, to be established are the doctrines that they hold. And many of those doctrines were established by the councils that were run under the Episcopal form of church government. The very canon that they used for the New Testament was established by the men who were functioning under an Episcopal form of church government. So we cannot discount the importance of the history and the tradition that allowed this form of church government to be established in the first place. Now we recognize that throughout history there are men who allowed the power to go to their head. There was corruption. There were things that were not run the way they were supposed to be, but that's part of humanity being involved. So to discount this form of church government completely because of the weakness of some leaders is to discount God's leading and God's guidance through the centuries. We can't totally discount everything that was done because of bishops who allowed power to go to their head when they became a part of the state government and not just the church government. So it is important to realize that history and the tradition of the church in those first centuries immediately following the apostles is very important in establishing church government. We also look at apostolic succession. Apostolic succession does not necessarily mean that we trace ourselves back to specific apostles. That would be impossible over so many years, after so many centuries and time has passed. But we look at apostolic succession in that continuity of apostolic teaching and apostolic faith. We are establishing and holding the apostolic doctrine as the apostles did. And that is what is important with the role of the bishops, the priests, the deacons, as they function and they work together to establish this form of church government. So in response to my colleague, I would have to say we cannot discount history and tradition. And we have to realize that the Scripture is very important, but when it comes to church government, the Scripture does not establish one set form of church government. We have to look at the Scripture, see what it says, but then we also look at the history and the tradition of the church as it was directed by God. It was led by God into a form of church government that lasted for centuries. And it was not until much, much later that other forms of church government began to come on the scene.